Okay, for question 1 of this revision lecture 7 on differentiation and its application to, what we are actually having is that we have the curve y equals to fx as shown here, and we are supposed to actually sketch the graph of y equals to f prime x, which is actually the graph of the gradient. So, as we have actually discussed this before, to actually do this question, the very first thing you actually have to take note of is the turning point. And for this particular question, the turning point is actually at -3, -7. Now, why turning point? Because we all know that at the turning point, the gradient value is actually equal to 0, which means if I actually want to know a point that's actually on the graph y equals to f prime x, I know that one of the points will be -3, 0. Next up will be that we are actually look at the vertical asymptote for the original graph, which is actually x equals to 2. Now, please take note that at the vertical asymptote x equals to 2, you can actually see that the gradient itself is actually getting more and more vertical, which means that the value of the gradient is actually becoming bigger and bigger in terms of magnitude, approaching to infinity. Hence, with this concept, it actually means that x equals to 2 is also the asymptote for the graph y equals to fx. Sorry, y equals to f prime x. Now, once you actually settle all this preparation work, actually we are ready to actually sketch the graph of y equals to fx. But there is actually one more thing that you can actually put into the graph of y equals to f prime x. Please take note that for this particular graph here, you can see that we actually have the horizontal asymptote y equals to 2. But please take note that when the graph is actually approaching to this vertical asymptote y equals to 2, the gradient is actually getting more and more vertical. Now, if the gradient is actually getting more and more horizontal. So if the gradient is actually getting more and more horizontal, it means that the value of the gradient is actually approaching to 0. Okay, in other words, y equals to 0 is actually the horizontal asymptote for the graph y equals to f prime x. So after we have done all this, we are ready to actually sketch a graph. Now, what is the strategy of sketching such a graph is that we actually observe the gradient of the graph region by region. Now, I will actually start from this region first, okay, the region whereby x is more than 2. Now, for the graph y equals to fx, you can see that the gradient, first thing we observe is that it's all positive gradient. Second thing we observe is that the gradient is actually getting more and more gentle, which means that the value of the gradient is positive and decreasing. Hence, to actually sketch the graph of y equals to f prime x for x more than 2 is that the graph will actually appear above the x-axis, reason being that the gradient itself is positive, the value of the gradient itself is positive, and the value of the gradient is actually decreasing. Hence, the shape of this graph that I just sketched will actually represents, okay, that following conditions. Next up is we will actually look at the region between, okay, from x equals to -3 to x equals to 2. Same thing, you can see that the gradient itself is actually positive and increasing. So for the graph for f equals to f prime x from -3 to 2, the graph must appear above the x-axis and must exhibit the property that is actually increasing in value. So we know that the graph should look something like this. Okay, approaching the asymptote, x equals to 2. Now, the last part that we actually need to sketch is actually x less than -3. Now, for x less than -3, the very first thing that we observe is, first thing first, all the gradient values are actually negative, which means that my graph must appear below the x-axis for y equals to f prime x for the region x less than -3. Second thing to observe is that if you actually look at the magnitude, okay, of the gradient, you can see that it's actually increasing first, but later will actually decrease slowly, approaching to 0 itself. So how to actually sketch a graph such that you can actually have the graph below the x-axis and yet, okay, towards the left, okay, you can actually we actually have to let the graph approach to 0 because the gradient value is actually approaching to 0. So the way that we can actually make sure that this can happen is something like this. So once this is done, this will be the graph for y equals to f prime x.